Greetings, and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. In the past decade or so, it has become, unfortunately, easier to imagine how many East Romans felt in the Palaiologan period. This is the last couple of centuries of the independent history of the East Roman state. I'm referring especially to the last century and a half. There's huge wealth inequality, elites who seem to be concerned more about themselves and their international connections and opportunities than their professed interest to the common good. The political system seemed corrupt and detached and unaccountable. There was a looming sense of decline and of imminent catastrophe, or of a catastrophe that was bound to come sooner or later, about which no one could seem to get their act together well enough to respond. And meanwhile, Roman society is torn apart by culture wars. Culture wars about things that seem to us incredibly trivial. And how could people be fighting about this? Like mystical lights seen during prayer, or union with the Catholic Church stumbling over, a couple words or parts of words in a creed and, minor things. There were some serious things too, but there were also a lot of minor things that people were fighting about. You think, is this really what you're choosing to, is this the hill you're going to die on while all of that is going on? I get a similar sense with a lot of what's going on today. If you read the news and you compare it to, what the problems we're actually facing, there seems to be a big discrepancy. Anyway, the Palaiologan period is, pretty grim and kind of depressing, even though it had some high points, and this is something worth dwelling on. In fact, I recently had to write the history of this period, and I had to make some choices about how to represent it. And I wasn't going to dissemble the decline just because we're supposed to avoid that term and its connotations. It was very real. But at the same time, there were some East Romans who were trying to find a sort of shred of dignity amidst all of that and do what they could to carry on. And one of those was the Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, who lived through some of the worst period from the middle of the 14th century to around 1425. So I tried, in writing the history of the Palaiologan period, to find the people, the moments, the efforts that many were making to retain a semblance of East Roman Orthodox dignity in all of that chaos and decline and fear of collapse. And he was probably the prime exhibit. So my thinking about this topic has been shaped by the work of two colleagues. One of them is Cecily Hillsdale, and you can hear my conversation with her in episode 18. So her wonderful book on this topic explores how Manuel and others use diplomacy and differential diplomacy, that is, knowing what different audiences want to hear or receive from you in order to continue to project the prestige of Constantinople and Roman Orthodox culture in that age. And the second is Siren Çelik, whom we've also had on the podcast before, though talking about a different topic. This is episode 12 on Byzantine studies in Turkey. Her academic focus for years has been Manuel II and, in fact, his written works and his self-representation in those works. Now, Manuel II happens to be the Roman emperor from whom we have the most written material, especially kind of autobiographical and self-referential texts. Most Roman historians will tell you that's probably the Emperor Julian living 11 centuries earlier, but in fact, it's Manuel II. It kind of depends on how late you think Roman history goes, but all of us know how late it goes, and Manuel is definitely part of it. So he wrote about most aspects of his life, though some he didn't, and we kind of talk about those in the conversation as well. Manuel's life experiences were incredibly diverse, let's say. He went from being on the inside of the family to an outcast of the family to governing Thessaloniki and Constantinople and then in exile and back again, having to campaign in Asia Minor with the Ottoman Sultan to help the Ottoman Sultan defeat his rivals in Asia Minor, then traveling in Western Europe, going as far as France and Britain in search of aid, while Constantinople was being besieged by that same Sultan, Bayezid. And through it all, he was writing these literary works that were sort of reflecting on his position, and I would say more broadly on his identity, on what we have come to call Byzantine identity, but was for him very Roman, very Hellenic, very Orthodox. When he was in the West, he wrote in Greek in defense of Orthodoxy. When he was in the East, serving under Bayezid, he wrote about Islam and Orthodoxy and what separated the two. And Aristophanes was one of those things, knowledge of Aristophanes. So he's drawing also on his classical paideia. So he was a person who, in very difficult circumstances, was always trying to articulate, what was so special about not just himself, but his identity, which he shared with many, many of his compatriots. Now, he had many disputes with them, too. This, again, was an age of culture war, and so he was involved in some of it. But I think especially if you read Siren's careful analysis of all of his different works, you will come away thinking that, he did so with a certain amount of dignity, which was perhaps all that he could do in those circumstances. One thing also to keep in mind here is that Manuel wrote in a very difficult form of Attic Greek. I have stared at some of his sentences for long periods of time trying to decipher them. So Siren's work is truly a feat. The book is called Manuel II Palaiologos, a Byzantine Emperor in a Time of Tumult. And here then is my conversation with Siren. Hello, Siren. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, Anthony. Thank you for having me again.
So you were one of my first guests way back. And I remember we were talking about, we'll do a podcast when your book comes out. And for you, I think the book was still in production. It must have seemed like that'll be in forever. And I was working on the early parts of my history, and Manuel II just also seemed like we'll never get to that. That'll never happen. Nevertheless, your book came out. I got to Manuel II. So this is a great moment to bring it together and talk about him and your book. It's I think the second book on the podcast that I had a discussion with someone who was working on a book. I think it was Elena Beck, yes. And she was working on a book, but it wasn't yet there. And then, the book was finished. It was published. It came out. We did a podcast on it. So you're the second one of those. So I really like that the podcast has that kind of depth now. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling. So why don't you start by telling our audience who Manuel II Palaiologos was and why you chose to write your dissertation and then a full-length monograph on him.
Okay. Manuel II is one of the last emperors of Byzantium. And he was actually the father of the last two emperors as well. And he had quite an eventful life, as the title of my book suggests, The Emperor in a Time of Tumult. So even as a young man, he endured lots of civil strife within his family, lots of fighting for the throne, also after he became the sole emperor, lots of conflicts with the Ottomans. Actually, his reign witnessed no less than 3 sieges by the Ottomans. As later on, perhaps we will touch upon, he traveled to Europe to seek help. And not only that, he was also a very, very prolific author. So he wrote many, many works in various genres like letters, orations, poems, theological works, philosophical works, sermons, so on and so forth. And I found him to be a very talented author as well. And of course, because he was an author, he also had a wide network of Byzantine literati around him at the time. So whoever was an important Byzantine thinker or author at the time, like Demetrios Kydones, Manuel II, he was also in contact with them, collaborated with them on some of his works, etc. So naturally, I find him to be a very colorful life, and writing his biography was very exciting. I actually, for the first time, met with Manuel when I was an undergrad. I wanted to be a Byzantinist, so I had taught myself Greek, and I was translating whatever bits of text I could find. And of course, one of my main sources was the Byzantine prose anthology of Nigel Wilson. And this one actually has an excerpt from Manuel, his letter to Manuel Chrysolovas from London. And it was the first time I had, read it. I had actually translated it into Turkish. Of course, I found it terribly difficult, but it had intrigued me so much. And at the time, I couldn't also access the full letter collection by George Dennis. So I couldn't read it. I couldn't also access John Barker's wonderful book. And a few months later, I ended up also translating Manuel's expresses on a tapestry in Paris, edited and translated also by John Davis. And I also found this text incredibly difficult for the time being, and but also fascinating. So I already had decided that I would do my MA in Birmingham, and actually studying the letters of Manuel II was one of my options. To make a long story shorter, when I went to Birmingham, I discussed several options with my late supervisor, Dr. Makrides, and then we both decided that working on the letters of Manuel would be a good option. And I worked on their literary style, its networking, etc. Small MA dissertation. And of course, I did want to do a PhD. I always wanted to be a historian. And as soon as I set foot in Birmingham in that fall, of course, we were talking about PhD applications, funding, etc. And I needed to come up with a PhD topic too in order to be eligible for funding. And I already, by that time, had checked out Manuel's letters and other works from the library. I had read Professor Barker's wonderful book, and I had become really sort of a Manuel person. And I was saying, how about I do a big, new book on Manuel, new biography, but not like Professor Barker, but from a literary angle. And then so my topic officially, shaped as being a new biography of Manuel II. And I also chose this topic not only because of Manuel, because I realized that since he had such an eventful life, contacts with Western Europe at the same time with Ottomans, I was going to have to use like a variety of sources, which would be entertaining and nice. I would have to deal with many different topics: politics, daily life, a bit of architecture, I don't know, lots of text. So I thought that this would be a very satisfactory PhD dissertation.
Yeah, so you mentioned a letter that Manuel wrote from London and also a work that he wrote in Paris. So you're alluding to this famous journey to the West that he went right in the late 14th, early 15th century to find aid for Constantinople, which was besieged. I find it interesting that you and Manuel are from the same place, and you also traveled to Britain and you studied there. And so there's very interesting parallels between you and him that
I hadn't thought of this before, actually.
Anyway, we'll get into those later if you want. Now, Manuel has received an excellent biography by John Barker, and you got to know John, right, in those years. Tell us a little bit about your interactions with him.
Well, of course, his biography, I have to say, is an excellent work. Okay, I did write a later and second biography on Manuel, but I really admire Professor Barker's work. Now, I did start corresponding with him when I was a junior fellow in Dumbarton Oaks, and I have to admit, up until that point, I was always a bit afraid. I was afraid that Professor Barker would be unhappy that I was writing a new biography, that maybe he would find me too young, he wouldn't like me. But I finally did introduce myself to him, because also many people around told me he's not like this at all, and he's a gentleman, very supportive person. I wrote to him and he replied to me like within hours, saying how happy he was. He always wanted to see a new book on Manuel II. He wished me all the best. And after that, we stayed in correspondence. So I would, of course, write to him on important occasions. We spoke about the book. I informed him of all the progresses in my academic life, like fellowship, jobs, articles, the progress on the book. He read my article on the dialogue with a Persian, sent me like his comments on that. And although we hadn't met face to face up until that point, I did start feeling very close to him. Not only because we had worked on the same topic, but he was such a warm and encouraging person. And he was also extremely funny, very witty, like he had such jokes in his emails. It was brilliant.
Yes.
And finally, around the same time that we were having our first podcast with you, I was at Harvard as a postdoc. And that year, we had the Byzantine Studies Conference in Wisconsin. And already Professor Barker and I had made plans to meet there in person. And he was telling me that my health is not good, but I hope, you and I will be able to meet them. We were supposed to meet at the conference that day and then later see each other outside the conference. But unfortunately, when he was coming, he got sick on his way to the conference. But again, to make this long story short, I did visit him in the hospital. He was very lucid, and we did speak a lot about a lot of things like Manuel II, our shared love for history, for music, many, many other things. And as a present, he also gave me his copy of, many offerings, his own author's copy of Manuel II book, and many, many other things. And we made plans when he's better, he's back home. We could do like Skype or Zoom calls. But unfortunately, we lost him 2 days later. And of course, I was delighted that I finally got to meet him face to face. But his loss was, of course, really, really sad.
Yeah, he was a lovely person, and I think your books are complementary. I used them together when I was working on that period, because they illuminate different parts of Manuel's life in different ways.
Completely, yes.
Yeah, and I first met John Barker at the Byzantine Studies Conference in 1994. When it came to Ann Arbor, Michigan, I was a student there, and it was literally 1 block from my house. And so I went. I remember the first night when all the professors were meeting. I think it was a board meeting or something like that, but other people were invited. And there were some people who were having a pretty serious fight. And I, of course, at the time, I had no idea what it was about or why they were, so angry at each other. And John Barker stood up at the end, and he just very eloquently, in a very witty way, that he calmed everybody down and got them to talk again. And I thought, wow, it's an impressive feat. But anyway, yes, it would have been great to have him on the podcast too, but it started too late. So let's go back to your work and your interest in Manuel and his period. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the state of the empire, and I'm putting those words in quotation marks, under Manuel, and what are some of the main challenges that he was facing, and then we'll sort of contextualize your work in there.
Yeah, I mean, as you just mentioned, it is empire in quotation marks only, and this is one of the major problems of his reign, that essentially the Byzantine Empire has now been confined to an extremely small territory, Constantinople, from time to time the city of Thessaloniki, a bit of land in the Morea, and lots of political problems, pressure from the Ottomans, and significant Ottoman expansion under Manuel's reign as well. Of course, because now the Venetians and the Genoese were extremely influential in Byzantine economy, the Byzantines also had to deal with them. Yes, they also, received significant support from the Venetians and the Genoese, but of course they had lots of political conflicts as well. And of course, when you start losing that much territory, and you also lose the control of your trade, your economy, of course, you also start having lots of very big economic problems, like the state is poor. This is also reflected very well in Manuel's writings. Mm-hmm. There is problem with the taxation. The regular people, especially the poor people, are increasingly getting poorer and poorer. There are social problems because of that polarization between the rich and the poor. Of course, again, social problems because of the civil war, people supporting, other candidates like Andronikos IV or John VII. Again, problems caused by theological controversies. Like these conversions to Catholicism, different stances towards the church union. Again, the problem of Palamism, I mean, it was more or less settled in Manuel's time, but it still was a source of contention for the public. So it was a very sort of, how to say, time of troubles.
Oh, yes. As many troubles as you can imagine, like this,
Oh,
they're
yes.
all packed in there. Yeah. And he had like virtually no army, no money.
Nothing.
No, but he
Almost.
had his city and he had his throne and his crown and literary ability, and lots of friends and supporters. So let's talk about what you've done with Manuel. What your book is not exactly a traditional biography, though it does follow the course of his life in a chronological fashion. So what did you hope to accomplish in this book? Or what was your approach that makes it different from a traditional biography like the one that John wrote?
Yeah, I mean, already, first of all, because Professor Barker had covered this political biography so excellently, I don't think that there was the need to do a second one. Second, my interests as a historian, as you can tell, are very different. I chiefly wanted to focus on Manuel as a literary figure. So I wanted to analyze his whole corpus, all of his writings, discuss his metaphors, imagery a little bit, especially study his self-representation, trace some of his philosophical and theological thoughts. And I also wanted to focus on Manuel as a person. So I didn't want to only speak about wars or policies, civil strife, I don't know, economy, taxation, but I wanted to also sort of bring out Manuel as much as I could as an actual human being, like relationship with his family members, friends, foes, also to try to envision his daily life, which is also possible because he did, refer to his daily life in his writings, of course, again, through the lenses of a self-representation technique. But I also wanted to discuss things like his hobbies, like hunting, his travels to Europe, not only in what sort of negotiations he was engaged in, but like the sights he would have seen, the food he would have eaten, what was like a typical day for him at the Vlaherna Palace. So these were the sorts of things that I wanted to analyze and to highlight in my biography. So my work, as you said, I do call it a biography, but it is not a traditional biography in the sense that it, narrates political events, etc. But I envision this sort of like an amalgam of a literary study, like a literary biography, with a touch of personal biography, and supplemented by discussions of Manuel's politics and reign. So I would say that this is actually an amalgam of many things. At any rate, this is what I think. And from point to point, of course, although I did follow a chronological approach, starting with his birth, his childhood, etc., ending with his death, I do also have digressions at certain topics. For example, in my, let's say, chapter 6, I also discuss Constantinople in Manuel's time in a few brief paragraphs, just to, flesh out his world. Or in chapter 8, I have a digression on his life at the Vlaherna Palace, things like that.
Yeah, and what enables you to do that is the fact that he wrote so much and that he touches on all of those aspects of his life that you just mentioned in his own works. In fact, I think there's only one other emperor we can do this with, and that's Julian. And because Julian also was a prolific writer, and he died much younger, his corpus is much smaller, and 1,000 years early, more than 1,000 years earlier. But it's also relentlessly autobiographical, also in that he's always commenting on his own experiences and his past and his reactions to things. And Manuel is doing the same. And it's because that Manuel draws attention to his own reactions and his experiences, and fashions these images of himself in all of these different contexts that you can write this book. It's not something that you can do for most emperors, right? Even take Leo VI, who also produced a significant body of writings, but they're not about himself. Like he rarely ever mentions himself or any, these kinds of tidbits that you can structure a sort of self-representational biography around. So why do you think that Manuel wrote so much about so many issues of his personal life about every phase and problem that he faced during his life? So what was he trying to accomplish with all of this? It's very rare for an emperor to do this.
I think, it again is an amalgam of many reasons. First of all, he, of course, like Julian, Leo VI, and other authors, is also using his writings as a political tool. So these are not, like letters or like novels or, or these are not pieces like modern literature only written because for, solely for the purposes of aesthetic. So of course, almost all of his works, even his theological works, are filled with, political messages. His self-representation is very dominating. He's always trying to legitimize his rule, defend some of his more problematic decisions, defend himself against his critics and against his competitors. He's always, trying to construct this self-portrait as this dutiful, blameless emperor who is totally devoted to his craft. And he's always hindered by the difficulties. So of course, naturally, one of the reasons why he wrote all of these pieces is for issues of ideology and for sending out political messages. Of course, he also networked with all of the Byzantine literati at the time, and we know both through other sources and from his writings that these were, sometimes read aloud in theatra, in literary gatherings. They were sent to other people. So these texts did circulate around. And this, of course, was a very important feature of his work. Of course, some of his work is also written for specific purposes, like the funeral oration, for example, is written on the occasion of the death of his brother, Theodore, Despot of Morea. Or works like his Mirror of Princes or the 7 Attico-political orations. Again, of course, all of this is again filled with political messages, but these were also probably conceived as tools for the education of his son and heir, John VIII. But I would also say that he wrote so much because he enjoyed generally writing for his own sake, and he was a talented author, and I think he knew it. Of course, I do acknowledge this political side of his writings, and I think I deal with quite a lot in my own book. But I also wouldn't want Manuel's writing and authorship to be seemingly like one-dimensional. I also think he wrote because he liked to. He, I think, generally cared about textual aesthetics, enjoyed writing, enjoyed experimenting with different genres. He was good at it, at least this is what I think. And I think he also was well aware of it. So I think it was like the perfect combination. Because yes, many other emperors who were especially brought up as princes received excellent educations, and Manuel is not our only author emperor in Byzantium, but also other emperors, many of them didn't write at all. So I think it was a combination of talent, interest, and this political aspect of things.
Yes, and it's important to stress that he wrote in many different genres.
Yes.
So much so, so you mentioned a funeral oration, and we have his letters, and he wrote some sort of quasi-philosophical dialogues, one on marriage, one about Islam, one about sort of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and ekphrases and rhetorical works, and on and on and on. It's almost like he was, he enjoyed trying his hand at different, genres, and he is a very gifted author too, and a very difficult one to read at times too. So
yes,
you must have some, war trauma from or whatever.
Yes, I did, especially in my early years as a PhD student, but I found him well worth the efforts.
It's rough. Yeah. So tell us, just to give our audience a sense of him as an author. So what's one of your favorite images or metaphors or whatever that he uses somewhere in his work? Even a small thing that you just really liked?
Okay, I really enjoy Manuel's uses of water and sea metaphors and imagery. Now, I also stress this in my book. This is, of course, not unique to Manuel. Using sea and water metaphors was very commonplace in Byzantine literature. We have many topoi, commonplaces relating to that. But when I analyzed them as an author, I did find that Manuel displays a particular fascination with water and sea images. It is not like something that occurs once or twice somewhere. It is something that he is especially interested in. And I find that he also transcends the usual commonplaces. Yes, of course, the usual, ship of the state, speaking about like stormy seas to describe troubles. He of course uses these commonplaces too, but he also has very interesting descriptions too. For example, in his discourse to Kavasilas, he writes this when he was exiled by his father because he lost Thessaloniki in 1380s. He writes to his correspondent Kavasilas that he hasn't drowned, but he is merely floating on the surface of the water. Or when he's speaking about like the calm seas and how he's longing for like a respite from all these troubles, he's describing it very, very eloquently. Or he's sometimes using very interesting ideas that I couldn't find a precedent for. Like he's saying that this is as futile as sitting at the one end of a ship and that you tie a rope to another end of the ship and you try to, pull back the boat. So his sea metaphors and water metaphors were the things I really enjoyed in his writings. But also, generally, I find his imagery to be vivid. This is something else I enjoy. For example, in his dialogue with a Persian, or like his discourse on dreams to Asanes, he has these descriptions of these nice fireplaces giving you warmth, setting out the atmospheres. The dialogue with a Persian, this dialogue on Islam and Christianity, which I think is my favorite work by Manuel, is again filled with very interesting like character portrayals, like his Mudarris, for example. This Islamic scholar with whom he was conversing is so well fleshed out. Okay, he said, yes, he's a barbarian, he's not like us. Of course, there is only a certain point as to he could comprehend all these conversations, but he also portrays himself as a witty man, gentle host, respectable man, somebody who likes God, who lives like a scholar and a philosopher simply. And he also describes in detail their jokes, their dinners. And at parts, I feel that the dialogue with a Persian reads almost like a modern novel. So that's another thing, for example, I like about Manuel, that his character portrayals are well thought of and really well fleshed out.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach, because that work is usually studied from the standpoint of, Byzantine perceptions of Islam and polemical arguments and all of that. And scholars find, oh, well, the arguments are all well known. He's just kind of recycling them. Which for the most part is true, but you found this sort of personal touch that he infuses into the whole thing.
Oh, yes. When I compared it with other Islamic dialogues produced at this time by his friends like Makarios Makres, his father Ioannis Kantacouzinos, it is really different in terms of character portrayal and literary style.
I love the one, was it you who pointed this out, where he mentions like Aristophanes, the comedian, at one point?
Yes, yeah.
And
it's
he
funny.
He makes an Aristophanic joke, but I think he also says something, but you wouldn't know who that is, right?
No, he doesn't say that. He refers to Aristophanes' play Welt, saying that, so the prophet would say Aftotatos, just like Welt, and the Mudarris replies, we don't know Aristophanes.
Okay.
And you, as a Byzantine reader and audience, you of course automatically understand he doesn't get the joke because he's not familiar with this Hellenic pedia. Yes. Whereas, of course, Manuel and his audience, they would have found this terribly funny.
Yes, I found that a recurring theme in his works, that he's constantly playing up this sort of the Hellenic or the classical heritage as a point of identity for himself and his circle and his audience and his subjects more broadly. Like, we may have lost our empire, but we still have that, and we can still make Aristophanic jokes that nobody else gets. My favorite moment, it was that one, until I came across, I was reading the acts of one of the accounts of the Acts of the Council of Ferrara, Florence. And there's this point where his son, John VIII, who went to Italy to the council, and he's telling the Italians something. He wants to quote Homer, and he says, well, we have a poet among us named Homer, and he has this line about, well, it's getting late and we should go and eat or something. I love the fact that he has to say, well, he has to explain like who Homer is to these. Anyway, I don't know if he's trolling them.
That would be taking things a little too far, I think.
Yeah. No, I know you know who Homer is, but we're the only ones who have access to the original. So anyway, all right. So Manuel is one of those authors and he reminds me in this respect of a lot of Michael Psellos, right, the 11th century, whom you always suspect that in some way or another he's talking about himself or is like autobiographizing, even if it's not overtly on the surface. Like he's building up an image of himself with almost everything he's talking, well, not everything, but most of the things he's talking about. So, would you say that? I mean, were you like on the lookout for like indirect autobiographical references? Why is he doing that?
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think this case also applies to Manuel. So, yes, most of his work is autobiographic. So, even if he's not directly speaking about himself or an event, there are always, he never lets you forget, I would say, who the author is, that it is an emperor writing. And of course, there are always like these sort of subtle references. And I think the reason he's doing is in order to, send out all these political messages, offer this self-representation to his audience as this beautiful, but also gifted, multi-talented emperor who can, engage in theological debates, understand philosophy, write beautifully, give beautiful orations, but also accompany the Ottoman Sultan on a campaign, fight, make political decisions. So yes, he really puts himself forward in his writings. Of course, in pieces like the funeral oration, some of the letters, or like the discourse to Jacob, we have direct autobiographical accounts as well. He speaks about his childhood life, etc. But even in seemingly irrelevant texts like the discourse on drunkenness and adultery, this was a rhetorical exercise based on Libanius. For example, in order to speak about the ultimate happiness, he says the people who are in purple. So, for example, even there you can see what his idea of perfect happiness is, the imperial purple.
Right. I had the impression that, so there are a number of ways you can take that. So you can say, well, okay, it's a gifted politician who's using, his rhetorical abilities to, promote himself in a narrow political way or, ideological or whatever. I sometimes had the impression that it was almost a response to the rather dismal situation of his state and, his culture. They knew that things were not going well. They knew that any minute the whole thing could collapse. And he was creating an idealized image of what, of the best that their culture could produce, right? In terms of religion and learning and sort of being a gentleman and a scholar who can go on campaign and all that, like as a point of pride for them. Like here's, our culture offers these kinds of ideals, and I'm going to kind of embody them in my own self-representation to give you all a kind of point of pride that at least we have a leader like that. I was just getting the sense that he was doing that.
Yeah, but he also got criticized for the very same reasons, that he was, spending time with literary studies. He shouldn't be engaged in theology.
I see. Like that's a distraction from his real duties or something like
exactly. That. And you see this in the discourse to Jacob, in some of his letters. So he apparently did receive criticism on that, which of course he fights back, with great fervor.
Yeah.
But I also think that perhaps he also wrote so much. And of course, I'm not the first person to think so. Like the editor and the translator of the Dialogue on Marriage, Athanasios Angelos, also suggests that he also perhaps wrote as a comfort, like for seeking solace, especially in difficult times. Okay, you could also say that maybe he's also doing that because the difficult times are when he really needs to up his game, defend and silence all the critics, etc. But for example, during the blockade of Constantinople by Bayezid I, he really wrote so many works.
Yeah.
So maybe he also wrote this, as an outlet.
In a certain sense, he was right. I mean, I don't think that there was much that he could do practically. And even his long trip to the West was, like, from a practical political standpoint, was just a failure. But we do remember Manuel for his works and this kind of image that he projected. And similarly for his campaigns with Bayezid in Asia Minor. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because Bayezid is about as close as Manuel gets to having a nemesis, like someone he really, really hates, but he's in this really complicated relationship with him. So tell us who that is and what Manuel says about it.
Okay, so Bayezid I, also known as Yıldırım Bayezid or Bayezid the Thunderbolt in Turkish, is one of the early Ottoman sultans. And he's not the only Ottoman sultan that Manuel had to contend with, but I would say that he's the chief one. Now, as an Ottoman ruler, Bayezid was very important because he really had a very aggressive policy of campaign, and he really did expand the Ottoman state into what we would call an empire. So he conquered lots of land in Anatolia from other Turkish emirates. He conquered lots of land in the Balkans. In this he was key as in this Ottoman expansion. Now, the thing is that Manuel and Bayezid, of course, were in a relationship of enmity as political rivals. Of course, you would expect that a Byzantine emperor and an Ottoman sultan would have some enmity or rivalry between them. But when you analyze Manuel's works, like his letters, his dialogue with a Persian, and many other ones, you understand, I think, that Manuel and Bayezid had a personal relationship of hatred as well, because Manuel doesn't exhibit this sort of hostility towards other Ottoman rulers like Murad I, Mehmed I, Ottoman princes during the interregnum. He, of course, also calls them barbarians, etc. But you can see that he takes it to the next level with Bayezid. And the thing is that these two were also personally acquainted because now Manuel, as the Byzantine emperor, was under the obligation to accompany the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid to his campaigns. And he did that, for example, very soon after he ascended the throne as the sole emperor. So in 1391, he had to leave Constantinople and join Bayezid on his Anatolian campaigns. And he technically served in the army of the Ottoman Sultan with his accompanying Byzantine soldiers. And of course, we have many sad and complaining letters from Asia Minor. He also says that, Bayezid I drank a lot. He was very unhappy about it. And he always points out that Bayezid I was a very irrational man. He was extremely volatile. He kept changing his mind. In the dialogue with a Persian, he also inserts lots of hints that Ottoman scholars do not also like him. And there was this very personal relationship. And at one point, for example, Bayezid I also summoned Manuel and his brother Theodore and John VII to Sirens. And then they met. And Manuel even claims that he was going to murder us there. Of course, I mean, the truth is, right, under disputation, because this is what we learned from Manuel. But the next time Bayezid summons him, for example, Manuel disobeys. And actually, this triggers this 8-year-long blockade of Constantinople by Bayezid. And after Bayezid is defeated by Tamerlane at the Battle of Ankara, and substantially he later dies, Manuel actually writes two celebrating pieces. One is an epopee of Tamerlane, like what would have Tamerlane said when he had captured Bayezid. And even Tamerlane says, "Oh, you're so not worth it. I see that you were not a great man." And the other is a song celebrating the defeat and the fall of Bayezid. So clearly, in addition to being political rivals, I think there was also a clash of personalities there. And for personal reasons as well, Manuel disliked Bayezid.
Yeah, all sources, you get the sense that Bayezid was a pretty terrifying character. But he's building an empire. That, I guess, that's the appropriate, personality to have. But it just didn't mesh with Manuel at all. Like, I just don't think they had any common points that they could understand.
Yeah, also, we don't know what happened, really, when they were in campaign, through the interpreters, what they were speaking, what happened.
Right. Yeah, those details are very difficult.
I think it's a really interesting relationship because I think Manuel is so personal about it.
Yeah. No, clearly he rubbed him the wrong way. So let's flip geographical orientation and talk about Manuel's famous journey to the West. This is very celebrated. The only Byzantine emperor who went to England, and he wrote about it at length, and his hosts also wrote about his presence there. So we have lots of Western sources that talk about Manuel and their impressions of him. This kind of down and out but dignified figure from the East. So where did he go? What was he trying to accomplish? And what text did he write along the way? Why did he write those?
Okay, so this was also one of my favorite chapters, first in my dissertation, then in my book to write about. So in this very celebrated journey, he set out from Constantinople, which was blockaded by the Ottomans, in order to seek help against the Ottomans. As soon as, of course, this blockade starts, he starts corresponding with different European powers. Like, for example, Venetian Senate suggests to him that he should also correspond with France and England. And of course, through all these contacts, Western European rulers also do express an interest in helping him. Some of them start collecting money, like in England. Some Italian cities collect money. And the French king, Charles VI, also sends one of his famed generals, Marshal Boussisot, to Constantinople to help Manuel. And then it is also probably through the support of this Marshal Boussisot that Manuel decides to visit different European courts in person. First, probably because they thought this would be more effective that way. Second, also perhaps to, make a concession to John VII, his nephew, who was also contended for the throne. So Manuel left John VII in Constantinople as a regent, and he set out. And after a brief break in the Morea, he then goes to Venice. He visits other Italian cities like Milan, Padua, Pavia. Then through other cities, he proceeds as far as Paris. He spends lengthy amounts of time there at the court of Charles VI. We know that he was, for example, housed at the Palace of Louvre at the time. Mm-hmm. This is where he stayed. He actually attended Christmas celebrations at the court. He was invited to the wedding of famous Jean de Berry, who was the uncle of the French king and the famous art patron, the commissioner of Les Trévicheurs. And he also then crossed over to England. So he visited Calais. He waited a little bit at Calais, then he crossed to Dover. From there, he went to London and he went with Henry IV. He stayed at the Alton Palace. Again, he celebrated Christmas there. He was given a lavish banquet. And after a short time period, then he returns back to France. He stays there for quite a long time. And after the defeat of Bayezid, then he again makes his way back to Italy. And after again spending a little bit of time in Italy, he goes back to Constantinople. And in total, he almost stays for like 3.5 years. So we are really speaking about a very lengthy journey. And of course, what he was trying to do is to convince various rulers to help him, not only in terms of money, but to send armies to Constantinople. And unfortunately, he never succeeds in this. He always obtains promises. He writes in his letters, the French king has given us excellent promises. Henry has given us excellent promises. I'm so hopeful, but none of them materialize. So at one point, Charles VI even decides that he's going to send Marshal Boussisot as the head of an army, etc. But it never materializes because Boussisot is later appointed as the governor of Genoa. So in terms of political benefits, really there is none for the empire.
Yeah, in my history, I had to make a decision about this, and I decided to largely cut that trip out, in part because, first of all, you and John have covered it very well from different standpoints, but also because I felt in the end it was it didn't actually accomplish anything. It also, so I chose to focus on John VII, who was in Constantinople, and on the siege. And that it's almost like Manuel's journey has kind of like look at me, look at me, look at me. And like we pay attention to this fascinating image of him writing ekphrases of tapestries in the Louvre. But like the real history is going on with all the suffering in Constantinople. And so I just kind of chose to focus on that. But anyway, that's...
Yeah, but I agree that in a big volume on the entire Byzantine history, it is a bit out of place. But I think it deserves like a fascinating narration on its own.
It is.
And also, I would like to add, it is not only like Manuel's, lack of persuasion or that this mission was doomed to fail, but also we have to take into consideration that Also, the political situation in different European, polities at the time is rather bad as well. In Italy, for example, we have the Visconti, we have wars, interfighting between them. In France, Charles VI is actually mad. So, for example, during Manuel's visit as well, there are a very long time periods when he's inactive and when his uncles are acting as regents. So they also have their own problems. Like in England, for example, Richard II, with whom Manuel was corresponding with, has been ousted by Henry IV, who again has his own problems. He is facing rebellions, he has to consolidate his power. So really, helping Manuel and the Byzantines, I don't think that it would really rank very high in anybody's agendas, because all of them are actually also internally occupied. Second, really, what is in it for them? Because Manuel doesn't have funds, etc. There is not really like much of a reward apart from prestige.
Yeah, I like, actually, now that you mentioned prestige, I like Cecily Hillsdale's account of, Manuel and the West, and she stresses how he used classical culture as a diplomatic asset, and maybe not so much during his journey. And I think you bring this out well, that the things that he's writing, obviously, in this complicated, difficult Greek, are not addressed to Westerners, obviously, but his own subjects, his retinue, people back home, people like Chrysoloras and so on. But I think he understood that Western Europeans were eager to have classical culture and Greek manuscripts and things like this. And he exploited that later. He sent Chrysoloras on all these missions. And
certainly. And for example, he also later on wrote to Guarino of Verona, suggesting that he could maybe translate the funeral oration into Latin or Italian. So he wasn't too insistent, and he didn't connect like lots of long-lasting importance, bonds with French or Italian scholars he met, but he was also interested in reaching out there. The project never materialized, but he did want it, if possible, to be translated into Latin. And of course, in Chrysoloras, he found an excellent candidate, as this, this great literati, this very cultured person. So of course he used them in all of his diplomatic missions.
Yeah, and Chrysoloras began to teach Greek in Italy, and so it's one of those cultural assets that the declining East Roman Empire still had and could still give. Just as I remember Cecily talks about how Manuel was clearly understood that his relationships, for example, with the Slavic Orthodox world, were premised on more liturgical and ecclesiastical basis, and he used that too. Anyway, whatever. So we're almost out of time. I want to jump ahead to some questions that are about just more personal questions about like you and Manuel, because you're such an interesting pair. And I don't think that Manuel would have imagined ever that a Turkish woman would have mastered Hellenic paideia and understood sort of his cultural orthodoxy so well as to write this book about him, which represents him so very well. And to that degree, I think he would have been wrong. But that's looking far into the future from his standpoint. And now writers tend to identify with their subjects, especially that are writing biographies as you are. So do you have any sort of personal reflections on just, how did you engage personally with this strange person? I mean, Manuel is an odd person even in his own time, right? And is certainly so to us today. So did you form any kind of imagined personal relationship with him as you were writing this?
I mean, I would imagine like, what was he like in actual real life? What did he look like? Of course, we have his manuscript images, but what was he really like? And like you said, I always thought, even as a PhD student, if he knew about it, like how would he feel about it? There is this Turkish young woman writing his biography, reading his text, analyzing him, and I think he would have felt a certain sense of pride. Of course, it would be very surprising to him. This whole academia that we have today would be a surprise. That a descendant of his Ottomans is writing a biography, that I know Greek. It would be very interesting for him. But I also, feel that if we could, I could have met with him, we could have spoken a lot about our shared interests. Like I like, for example, some of the plays he enjoys, like Aristophanes' Wealth or Platon's Phaedo. I think these are some of the works he was especially fond of, and I really like them as well. I enjoy Greek literature too. So I think we had in common. We have some things in common with regards to that. He likes to be active in, different areas of the life. This is something that I like as well. But I also did wonder, like, how would have he felt about such a biography? And I was sometimes imagining, because I also say, this is a self-representation. Here he's trying to shift the blame. He's trying to legitimize his decisions. And he would say, take this part out, take chapter out. The part where I was Thessaloniki, why don't you take it out?
Yeah. No, for sure. Maybe, 500 years gives you some perspective.
Yes.
I mean, you're also from the same city.
This is something, yes, I also reflect upon. So especially whenever now I'm working around walking around the historical peninsula, I was like, this is where Manuel worked. When I'm, touring around the Ayvansaray Edirne Kapı area where we have the remnants of the Vlaherna Palace, it was Manuel's palace. Or Hagia Sophia, when I look at the Omphalion where the emperors were supposedly crowned, I know that this is the exact spot he stood upon. So it's really exciting.
Yeah. It gives you goosebumps. And his corpus is so large that honestly, there can't be more than half a dozen people alive today who have read it all. And even that might be too many. And so you're like, if he's thinking about his readership, and someone who wrote that much clearly was, like, you're among very, very few people who have read everything that he wrote.
Yeah, I'm one of his biggest fans and an avid reader. Yes,
and victims. True. His prose sometimes is
that's true. That's
torture. Okay, so final question: if you could meet him today, what would you ask him?
Now, this is going to sound extremely funny and very unscholarly.
Please,
but I would really like to ask, like, what his favorite foods were, or like what sort of clothes he was wearing. Of course, these are trivial questions. I completely understand, but he never makes any references to food or to clothing items. And I'm really curious about it because as a historian, I'm really interested in cuisine, food, and clothing. So I really wish, I would know like what sort of food he liked consuming. Also, I'm curious about like the two daughters he lost. I'm curious about their names. I suspect one of them might have been named Eleni after the wife and the grandmother.
Right.
I would also ask him probably if he has other writings, which he might have, that we don't have, an edition of today. Maybe he wrote something and it didn't survive.
Sure. Okay, those sound great. And yeah, no, I'm fascinated by food and clothing too. I mean, I've done a number of episodes. It's just one of those, kind of this curiosity about those things that our sources just rarely ever tell us about.
Yeah, in Manuel, we are very lucky in that we have a very, very small instance when the historian Francis mentions that Manuel is giving out clothes from his like chest, and he actually gives Francis a robe as well, and he describes it.
All right, Siren, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and for writing the book, which was immensely enjoyable and very useful for me because honestly, I wasn't going to read through all of Manuel's works. I wasn't going to do, not for this, but I'm glad that you did. So
I'm glad you liked the book.
And so, what's next? What can we expect next?
Well, I mean, currently I have a Turkish book waiting in the line to be published. It's a Byzantine poetry anthology from 4th to 15th centuries, translations about approximately 60 poems from Greek to Turkish with commentary. It is going to be a double text, Greek and Turkish facing each other. And of course, all of the poets will be introduced and explained. So this is one thing that hopefully will appear by summer, fingers crossed. And other than that, for the time being, I have put Manuel II behind me. And now I'm more interested in like notions of time in late Byzantine history writing. So I think this is going to be the next thing I will be writing.
Excellent. I look forward to those. And thank you again. And Siren, take care.
Thank you so much for having me here again. Bye.